Imagine it's 2023. You're a professor at Stanford University, right? You're standing at the absolute bleeding edge of modern technology.
Right, the pinnacle of the tech world.
Exactly. And you are grappling with what might be the most profoundly modern crisis imaginable. You sit down to write an article, and the title you give it is The Crisis of Consciousness in the Age of AI.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a heavy title.
Right. In this piece, you're asking these massive, terrifying questions that are basically keeping tech CEOs awake at night. Like, what actually is human consciousness?
Yeah, and can artificial intelligence ever truly become conscious?
Exactly. Is consciousness just this, biological function of the brain, just neurons firing in a dark skull, or is it something else entirely?
I mean, these are the exact questions defining our era right now.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate frontier.
Right.
Like, we've mapped the human genome, we've split the atom, right?
Yeah, we build these insane machines.
We build machines that simulate incredibly complex conversations, but the actual fundamental nature of the mind, it's still a complete black box.
It really is. The hard problem of consciousness is just this glaring omission in modern science. So to answer these intensely 21st century bleeding edge tech questions, this Stanford professor doesn't look to like a Silicon Valley manual.
Right, he doesn't just pull up the latest neuroscience journal.
No, he looks to a collection of texts written over 2,500 years ago. He literally turns to the Upanishads.
Which is just wild. But, what's fascinating here is that this Stanford professor is actually stepping into a very long, very elite lineage of thinkers who did the exact same thing.
Wait, really? Like who?
Well, when you look at the greatest minds of the 20th century, the people who built our modern understanding of reality, they were totally obsessed with these texts. Erwin Schrödinger, for example.
Wait, like Schrödinger's cat? The quantum mechanics guy?
The very same. One of the absolute pioneers of quantum physics. He stated unequivocally that his quantum theory would basically take seeds from the Upanishads for decades to come.
I just have to pause on that for a second because that is entirely counterintuitive. You have this pioneer of quantum physics, a guy dealing in subatomic particles and advanced math, looking at texts from ancient Indian forests.
From thousands of years ago, yeah. It sounds like a total contradiction until you realize what Schrödinger was actually up against.
Right, because classical physics had kind of broken down at that point.
Exactly. The Newtonian model, the idea of the universe as this giant, predictable clock, it just didn't work at the quantum level. So Schrödinger needed a whole new philosophical framework just to begin to understand the math he was looking at.
That's incredible.
And it wasn't just him. Carl Jung, one of the founding fathers of modern psychology, he kept a copy of the Upanishads right by his bed.
No way, by his bed.
Yeah, and Albert Einstein himself noted that these ancient texts gave him exactly the conceptual framing that modern science was desperately searching for to unify the universe.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we have a massive stack of incredibly rich material for this deep dive today. We're looking at translated Sanskrit texts, deep philosophical treatises.
Modern scientific data on brainwaves, acoustic physics.
Yeah, and even market reports on the modern mindfulness economy. We are covering a timeline that stretches from roughly 1200 BCE all the way to the AI boom happening literally right now.
It's a massive scope.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive today is to take all of that and distill the most mind-bending, practical, and scientifically relevant insights from the Upanishads. We want to show you, the listener, exactly why today's tech CEOs, quantum physicists, and psychologists are so obsessed with them.
Because, if you've ever felt overwhelmed by just the sheer noise of the modern world or feared the unknown, you need these answers.
Absolutely. If you've ever just sat there and wondered what the voice inside your own head actually is, you are about to get answers that have survived thousands of years of rigorous debate.
But to do that properly, we really need to start by deconstructing a massive myth.
Oh, for sure. Because when people hear a word like Upanishad, especially if they aren't intimately familiar with Eastern philosophy, there's this immediate assumption.
Right. They think, oh, this must be some dusty, dogmatic religious book.
Like a manual for temple rituals full of strict commandments and rules you just have to blindly accept.
Exactly. But reading through the translations of the history, that is completely wrong. It is actually the complete opposite of dogma.
Entirely the opposite. And to understand what they actually are, you really just have to look at the etymology of the word itself.
Yeah, let's break that down. It's a Sanskrit compound word, right?
Yeah, it breaks down into three distinct parts. So you have upa, which means near, then ni, which means sit down, and shad, which means destroy ignorance.
So the literal translation is essentially sitting near the teacher to destroy ignorance.
I love that framing so much. It completely changes the vibe. It's not a sermon from a mountaintop. I like to think of it as an intimate, high-level fireside chat.
Like an exclusive masterclass.
Yeah. Exactly. A Q&A masterclass between a mentor who spent decades observing the mind and a wildly curious student who absolutely refuses to accept easy answers.
That is exactly the right context. These texts are dialogues. They are rigorous, logical investigations into the nature of reality.
And we should probably give a sense of the historical scale we're dealing with here, too.
Yeah, the historical consensus places their composition roughly between 1200 and 200 BCE, though the oral traditions they're based on likely go back as far as 3000 BCE.
Which is just staggering to think about.
And they were originally composed in Sanskrit, which is this incredibly precise, almost mathematically structured language. But they've rippled out across the entire globe, translated into over 90 languages.
And it isn't just one monolithic book either. It's an entire library of distinct philosophical inquiries.
Correct. There are 108 total texts traditionally recognized in the canon. But out of those, there are 12 main ones that form the philosophical core, often called the principal Upanishads.
Right, the Upanishads.
Yeah.
Like the Isha, Kina, Katha, Prashna, Mundaka, Mandukya.
Paitiriya, Aitareya, Chandogya, Brihadaranyaka, Shvetashvatara, and Kaushitaki.
Just reading that list, you get a sense of the sheer volume of intellectual labor here. And for today, we're leaning on the rigorous work of scholars like S. Radhakrishnan, Swami Gampirananda, Patrick Olivelle, and even Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy.
Yeah, they've all spent careers mapping out how these texts have been debated and tested globally.
But despite that vastness, right, 108 texts, thousands of verses, the absolute core of this entire sprawling philosophy can actually be synthesized into just 4 ultimate truths.
Yes, the 4 Mahavakyas, or the great sayings. And I want to make sure we get the mechanics of these translations exactly right, because they form the foundation for everything we're exploring today.
Okay, let's hear them. Lay them on me.
All right, the first is from the Aitareya Upanishad, Prajnanam Brahma. This translates to, consciousness is ultimate reality.
Okay.
The second is from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Brahmasmi, meaning I am Brahma. Or, in modern terms, the fundamental essence of the universe and my own essence are not different. The third is from the Chandogya Upanishad, Tat Kivam Asi. That translates as, that thou art, meaning the ultimate truth you're searching for is already inside you.
Got it. And the fourth?
The fourth is from the Mandukya Upanishad, I am Atma Brahma. This self is Brahma.
Okay, I have to push back here for a second because I think a lot of listeners might be having the exact same reaction I am right now.
Go for it.
On the surface, those 4 sentences sound incredibly simplistic. I mean, they almost sound like bumper stickers or something you'd see on a motivational poster in a corporate break room.
Right, like you are the universe.
Exactly. Consciousness is reality. It sounds nice, it sounds comforting, but it feels a bit hollow. Like, where is the rigorous science we were promised?
That reaction is incredibly common. And it's exactly the trap most modern readers fall into with Eastern philosophy. We're so used to complexity equating to truth.
Yeah, we expect a bunch of equations or dense jargon.
Exactly. So when we hear something simple, we assume it lacks depth. But these aren't motivational slogans meant to just make you feel good. They are literal, mechanical descriptions of the architecture of reality.
Mechanical descriptions.
Yes. The simplicity is the result of thousands of years of stripping away unnecessary variables. It takes seconds to read them, but it takes decades of rigorous psychological and scientific inquiry to truly comprehend the mechanisms they describe.
Which is why we have to break them down using modern neuroscience and quantum physics today.
Precisely. To really grasp what these ancient thinkers were telling us.
All right, well, let's test that directly then. Let's take that fourth, saying, I am Atma Brahma. This self is Brahma. If this self is supposedly the ultimate reality of the universe, how do we actually define the self or the mind on a daily basis?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because if you ask a neuroscientist today where the self is, they'll struggle to point to a specific region of the brain. So where do these ancient texts even start looking for it?
To answer that, we have to look at the Mandukya Upanishad. And the Mandukya is incredibly special within the canon. It's actually the shortest of all the principal Upanishads. It's only 11 verses long.
11 verses. You could read the entire text in under 2 minutes.
You could read the words in 2 minutes, yes. But it might be the deepest, most dense, phenomenological text in human history. It acts as a 2,500-year-old manual of neuroscience.
Because they couldn't look at physical brain tissue back then.
Right, so instead of looking for the mind in physical tissue, they look at the experience of the mind. In just those 11 verses, it outlines the absolute architecture of human consciousness, categorizing our entire existence into 4 distinct operational states.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of those 4 states.
The first state is what they call Vaishvanara, which is the waking state. This is the baseline reality where you and I are right now. Your eyes are open, physical senses are active, and you're processing external data.
Right. You're interacting with a physical world that operates on agreed-upon physical laws. Gravity works, time moves forward linearly.
Exactly. That's the consensus reality. But then we have the second state, which is Tayasa, the dreaming state. And I want you to really think about the biological and psychological mechanics here.
Okay.
You close your eyes. The external physical world entirely vanishes from your perception. Your visual cortex isn't receiving photons from the room anymore. But you enter an inner world.
And what's crazy is that this inner world is generated entirely by your own consciousness.
Yes, and it feels 100% real while you're in it. You feel genuine biological fear if you're being chased. Your heart rate literally spikes.
You see vivid colors, you hear sounds, you talk to people who seem to have their own autonomy. It is profound when you really stop to analyze it.
It really is. The brain is fully simulating an entire cohesive 3D universe, populating it with characters, generating physics, all while the physical body is basically paralyzed in a dark room.
So the Mandukya points to the dreaming state as undeniable proof of the staggering power of consciousness to build realities out of nothing but itself.
Exactly. It shows that your mind doesn't just passively receive reality, it actively constructs it.
Okay, so waking is processing external reality. Dreaming is constructing internal reality. What is the third state?
The third state is prajna, or deep sleep. In this state, the mechanisms of the first 2 states completely shut down. No dreams, no waking world.
Just absolute darkness, a complete absence of experience.
But here is the paradox the Mandukya points out, and this is brilliantly subtle. When you wake up from a deep, dreamless sleep, what is the first thing you usually say?
You stretch, check the time, and say, wow, I slept really well.
Exactly. But think about the logic of that statement. How do you know you slept well?
Because, wait.
Right. You weren't actively aware. There was no active you experiencing the deep sleep, no data to process. Yet when you wake up, you carry a distinct memory of that peaceful absence.
Okay, wait, let me process that. If I remember that there was nothing happening, there had to be like a recording device still running.
Precisely.
The core observer never actually shut off, even when the mind and senses were powered down.
That realization forces the text to establish the fourth state, which it calls turiya. It literally just translates to the fourth. This is pure consciousness.
The state beyond the other 3.
Yes. You aren't asleep, you aren't awake, you aren't dreaming. It's pure contentless awareness, the underlying witness to all the other states. And it's often only accessible in the deepest states of meditation.
Let me try to ground this with an analogy, because the jump from deep sleep to pure consciousness is pretty steep.
Go ahead.
It's like, imagine the states of consciousness are a computer system.
Okay, I like that.
The waking state is when you're actively sitting at the desk, typing on the keyboard, running software. The dreaming state is like when you step away and the screensaver comes on, the computer is running its own weird internal loops and graphics.
Perfect.
Deep sleep is like putting the computer into hibernation mode. The screen goes black, the fan shuts off, it looks dead. But turiya is the actual electricity running through the wall that powers the entire machine across all those states.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Turiya is the raw electricity of awareness. It doesn't care if the screen is on or off. It just powers the potential for anything to happen.
And what's truly incredible is how modern neuroscience is just now, in the 21st century, mapping the biology of this ancient framework.
Oh, the 2019 Harvard Medical School study.
Exactly. Researchers looked at fMRI brain scans of advanced practitioners in incredibly deep states of meditation. And they were looking specifically at something called the default mode network, or the DMN.
The DMN is essentially the narrator in your head, right?
Yeah, it's the part responsible for our constant internal monologue, the part that worries about the past, plans for the future, and basically generates our sense of a separate, ego-driven self.
And what did the Harvard researchers find?
They found that in those profound meditative states, the default mode network completely quiets down. It basically goes offline, but the brain doesn't go to sleep.
Right, it doesn't enter prajna.
Exactly. Instead, the researchers mapped a distinct highly coherent state of pure, contentless awareness. The subjects weren't processing external stimuli, and they weren't lost in internal daydreaming. They were just purely awake.
So the neuroscientists essentially found a direct biological signature for what the Mandukya Upanishad categorized as the Turiya state thousands of years ago.
The machine goes silent, the narrator stops talking, but the power is still flowing perfectly. It's fascinating. But, the Mandukya doesn't just map the internal biology, it maps this outward to the acoustic science of the universe.
Ah, yes. The concept of the AUM Chan-OM.
Right. And I have to admit, this is where I start to get a little skeptical.
Let's explore the mechanics of it. The text meticulously aligns those four states of consciousness with the phonetic sounds of AUM. It's broken into three distinct syllables.
Okay.
The A sound, starting deep in the throat, represents the waking state. The U sound, rolling forward through the mouth, is the dreaming state.
Oh.
The M sound, where the lips close, is deep sleep.
And the fourth state.
The unbroken silence that immediately follows the chant represents Turiya, the underlying pure consciousness.
Right. And here is where the modern scientific data comes in. I was looking at the 2014 data from NASA that we pulled for this. Scientists there used complex instruments to record the electromagnetic vibrations of the solar system, specifically the sun.
Right, to capture signature.
They took those electromagnetic waves, translated them into acoustic sound waves, and found that the sun literally vibrates at a frequency of 136.1 hertz.
And then when we look at classical Indian music, the foundational note, the Sai note, which is the baseline for chanting AUM, is tuned precisely to 136.1 hertz.
But hold on, I really have to push back here.
I figured you might.
Space is a vacuum. Sound waves require a medium like air or water to travel. They cannot travel through the vacuum of space. So NASA is radiation and mathematically converting it into an audio file.
That's entirely accurate.
Furthermore, taking a mathematical conversion of solar radiation and mapping it directly onto a human vocal chant developed thousands of years ago, aren't we just finding Texas sharpshooter patterns? Aren't we drawing a bullseye around a random coincidence to make the ancient texts look prescient?
That is exactly the kind of rigorous skepticism we need to apply here. You are completely right that acoustic sound waves do not travel from the sun to the earth. However, the correlation isn't about acoustic travel, it's about foundational frequency.
How so?
When NASA instruments measure the periodic pulsations of the sun's plasma, those create immense repeating electromagnetic waves. When we scale those massive slow waves down into the spectrum of human hearing, the foundational mathematical ratio of that vibration translates to 136.1 hertz.
Okay.
Now, why does it matter that ancient Indian musicians locked onto that exact same frequency? It suggests that human consciousness, when quieted in deep meditation, is deeply sensitive to the fundamental mathematical and vibrational ratios of the natural world.
So they didn't need radio telescopes.
Exactly. By turning their observation entirely inward, they identified a baseline frequency of human biological and psychological resonance that remarkably mirrors the baseline frequency of our solar system's primary energy source.
So it implies a fractal universe.
Exactly. That the macrocosm, the universe, and the microcosm, the human nervous system, operate on the same fundamental mathematical geometry.
Okay, when you frame it as a fractal geometry rather than a literal sound traveling through space, that makes a lot more sense. The math of the inner world matches the math of the outer world?
And this exact realization that the internal observer and the external universe are fundamentally entangled is exactly what hooked Erwin Schrödinger.
It's the crux of his philosophical breakthrough, right?
Yes. Schrödinger read these texts with intense focus because he was struggling with the implications of quantum mechanics. Specifically, the idea that particles can be deeply connected across vast distances.
Quantum entanglement.
Right. He had this profound realization. I'll quote his own writings directly here. The plurality that we perceive is only an appearance. There is only one thing.
And that thought doesn't come from a physics lab.
No, it comes straight from the Mandukya's Mahavakya. I am Atma Brahma, this self is the universe. Schrödinger openly admitted that the Upanishadic concept of a single unified consciousness provided him the philosophical framing to conceptualize entanglement.
Because if reality is essentially one continuous field of consciousness, then non-locality particles interacting instantaneously across space stops being a paradox. It just becomes a logical feature of the system.
Exactly. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
That is just staggering. A 2,500-year-old text providing the psychological permission for a 20th century physicist to accept the strangest math in the universe.
But let's follow the logic here. Let's take the next step.
Where does it lead us?
Well, we've established this incredible architecture of the mind. We have this eternal electricity, this pure consciousness inside us that connects to the entire fractal universe.
If we genuinely accept that as true, why are we so terrified of the machine shutting down? If the electricity never dies, if the observer is fundamental, why does humanity possess such a profound, paralyzing, universal fear of death?
You have just articulated what is perhaps the most important psychological question of human existence. And answering that question transitions us perfectly into our next source text, the Katha Upanishad.
The Katha Upanishad contains one of the most brilliant narrative setups I've ever come across. It revolves around a young boy named Nachiketa.
Right, Nachiketa.
So Nachiketa is watching his father perform this massive, highly public religious ritual. The father is supposed to be sacrificing his most prized possessions to the gods to secure a place in heaven, but Nachiketa, who's this incredibly perceptive kid, notices his dad is cheating the system.
Oh, big time. He's sacrificing all these useless old bearing cows that can't even produce milk anymore.
It's a blatant act of hypocrisy. He's doing the mechanics of religion while completely ignoring the spirit of the sacrifice, and the boy sees right through it.
So Nachiketa, being this bold, frustratingly honest kid, goes up to his dad and starts bothering him. He says, "Since you're giving away all your possessions, who will you give me to?"
And he asks it over and over, interrupting the ritual until the father just snaps in a fit of absolute rage and yells, "I give you to death."
Which is a terrible thing for a parent to say, even in anger. But in the logic of the story, spoken words have binding power. He just condemned his son.
Right. So Nachiketa, taking his father's curse literally, leaves the physical world and goes directly to the door of Yama. Now, Yama is the lord of death in this tradition.
But when the boy arrives, death isn't home. He's out doing his job.
So this mortal boy sits on the doorstep of death for 3 entire days and nights without food or water, just waiting. When Yama finally returns, he is absolutely mortified that a guest has been neglected at his door.
Because hospitality is a massive cultural mandate in this context.
Exactly. So to make amends, Yama offers Nachiketa 3 boons, 3 wishes.
He uses the first 2 to secure his family's well-being and learn a fire ritual, which is standard. But his third wish, that changes the entire course of philosophical history.
Yes. He uses his final wish to ask the ultimate epistemological question. He looks at the Lord of Death and says, when a person dies, there is this great doubt. Some say they continue to exist, and some say they do not. What is the actual truth? What fundamentally happens when the physical body ceases to function?
And Yama, the Lord of Death, genuinely panics. This is the one secret he is not allowed to give away.
He tries everything to bribe the boy.
He says, even the gods are confused by this. Ask for anything else. I will give you unimaginable wealth, vast kingdoms, beautiful women, chariots, centuries of healthy life. Just do not ask me to reveal the secret of death.
But Nachiketa drops this profoundly deep psychological realization. He looks at all the wealth being offered to him, refuses the bribe, and says, Navatena tarpanyo manusya, meaning, man is never truly satisfied by wealth.
He realizes the trap. He essentially tells death, what good is a massive kingdom or endless wealth if you're eventually going to come for me anyway? The deep hunger of the human condition is for truth and permanence, not material distraction. He demands the truth.
It's a phenomenal setup. The text puts the ultimate question right in the hands of the only entity qualified to answer it, death himself. And because the boy's intellectual integrity can't be bought, Yama has no choice but to answer.
And the answer he delivers is immortal. He says, Najayate Mariate va vipashchyet. This translates to, the knowing self, the pure consciousness, neither takes birth nor does it die.
It is not created from anything, and it doesn't transform into anything else.
Exactly. It is eternal, ancient, and crucially, it is not killed when the body is killed.
It's an incredibly powerful statement, and just as a historical note, this exact phrasing was so profound that it was adopted almost verbatim hundreds of years later by the Bhagavad Gita in verse 2.2. It became the absolute cornerstone of Eastern thought.
But what's truly fascinating is that this isn't just ancient theology. This story perfectly maps onto the deepest layers of modern psychology.
Oh, absolutely. If we want to understand why Nachiketa's refusal of the bribe is so important, we have to look at terror management theory, or TMT.
Right, which posits that humanity's ultimate foundational psychological driver is the subconscious terror of our own mortality.
TMT argues that this single underlying fear of death is what actually drives almost all human behavior. It drives our obsessive pursuit of wealth, our rigid adherence to dogmatic cultural systems, building massive monuments, even our propensity for tribalism and war.
We build empires and accumulate massive 401ks to create a psychological buffer against the terrifying reality that we are biological organisms that will eventually shut down.
So, under terror management theory, we are all just taking Yama's bribe. Every day we take the chariots, the wealth, the promotions, just to distract ourselves from the fact that we're standing at the door of death.
Exactly. We accept the distraction because we lack the courage of Nachiketa to ask the real question. But the Katha Upanishad solved this psychological crisis 3,000 years ago.
By rigorously separating the eternal observer, the Turiya, from the temporary physical body.
Yes, it removes the root cause of the terror. If you genuinely realize that the true you cannot be killed when the biological body shuts down, then the frantic, fear-driven pursuit of wealth and legacy completely loses its psychological grip over you. You are freed from the terror management cycle.
Here is where it gets really practical, especially for anyone listening who uses modern technology, which is basically every single person on Earth. This specific philosophy, this fearless view of death derived from the Katha Upanishad, is literally baked into the foundational DNA of the most valuable company in human history.
You're talking about Apple. And the connection to Steve Jobs is perhaps the perfect modern example of this ancient wisdom meeting technological innovation.
I was reading through the biographies on Jobs. In 1974, long before he founded Apple, Steve Jobs traveled to India. He was explicitly searching for a spiritual teacher named Neem Karoli Baba, and throughout his entire life, Jobs kept the specific book physically on his desk at Apple.
Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi.
Exactly. That book is fundamentally based on the exact teachings of the Upanishads we are discussing. Fast forward to 2005. Jobs is giving his legendary commencement address at Stanford University. He had already faced his first bout with pancreatic cancer.
And he stands up in front of those students and delivers that incredible line.
Yeah, he says, remembering that you'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important.
It is the exact lived realization of Nachiketa. Jobs understood that if you strip away the terror of the body's death, you're left with absolute, uncompromising clarity.
He didn't build Apple because he was afraid of dying and wanted a legacy. He built it because realizing death rendered fear obsolete allowed him to focus purely on the essential truth of design and utility.
The Katha Upanishad wasn't just abstract theology to him. It was a highly practical, operational toolkit for living fearlessly and innovating without limits.
Okay, so we've hacked the ultimate fear. We've used the Katha Upanishad to conquer the fear of death. But let's pivot for a second, because the reality of the listener's daily life is complex. Not fearing death is fantastic, but, getting through a stressful Tuesday morning can still be remarkably difficult.
Very true. Life has its own intense struggles.
And our modern data paints a very grim picture of the daily human experience. The World Health Organization reports that over 280 million people globally suffer from clinical depression.
And in America, the Surgeon General has officially declared a loneliness epidemic.
We are hyper-connected digitally. We can video chat with someone across the globe instantly, yet people are feeling completely isolated and desperate for deep purpose.
It is the defining paradox of our modern technological era. We've conquered so much of the external physical world, built these incredible digital networks, yet the internal world is suffering immensely.
And to address the specific crisis of isolation, our deep dive brings us to the Chandogya and Taittiriya Upanishads. These texts provide what might be the ultimate epistemological antidote to modern loneliness.
Let's start with the Chandogya Upanishad. There's another amazing narrative here about a father named Uddalaka and his son, Shvetaketu.
Shvetaketu has just returned home after spending 12 years studying abroad at the most elite schools. Right?
Exactly. He's memorized all the texts, he knows the rituals, and he is feeling incredibly arrogant. Very proud of his elite education. He walks into the house thinking he knows absolutely everything there is to know about the world.
It's a very recognizable human archetype. The classic recent graduate who mistakes data accumulation for actual wisdom.
So his father, Uddalaka, who's a true sage, looks at his son's inflated ego and asks him a very piercing question. My son, did you ask your teachers for that single piece of knowledge that makes all other things known? That unseen reality which allows you to understand everything else?
And Shvetaketu is completely stumped. His 12 years of expensive education didn't cover that.
So the father decides to strip away the intellectual arrogance and teach him through a direct physical demonstration. He asks Shetakita to bring him a fruit from the massive banyan tree outside.
The son brings it, and the father tells him to break it open. Inside, there are hundreds of tiny seeds.
Then the father says, break open one of the seeds. What do you see inside it? Shvetakatu squints and says, nothing, father. It is completely empty. I see nothing.
And then Uddalaka drops the absolute hammer of realization. He points to that seemingly empty space and says, from this invisible essence which you cannot see, this massive towering banyan tree grew. The entire tree is contained in that invisible nothingness. You, my son, are exactly like that.
And here we arrived at the third Mahavakya we discussed earlier, Tativamasi, death thou art.
It's a beautiful story, but I have to stop and ask this on behalf of the listener. How does a story about a tree seed actually cure modern clinical loneliness?
That's the real test of it, isn't it?
Yeah. If a listener is sitting alone in a small apartment in a massive city, feeling completely socially isolated, how does a Sanskrit phrase like tat tivam asi practically help them?
To understand the practical application, we have to look at how this exact concept influenced modern psychology, specifically through the work of Carl Jung.
The legendary Swiss psychiatrist.
Exactly. Jung studied the Upanishads intensely. His entire foundational concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath our isolated personal memories, humanity shares a deep, interconnected psychological layer, is directly lifted from this idea of the invisible banyan seed.
Oh, wow. The universal archetypes.
Jung also developed the concept of individuation, which is the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are. He realized that true psychological health cannot be achieved in isolation. It requires understanding that your deepest core self isn't separate from the rest of humanity or the natural world.
So understanding tat tivam asi shifts your entire perspective on isolation.
Exactly. If you truly internalize it, you realize that the fundamental conscious essence animating your mind is the exact same essence animating the person walking past your apartment, the trees outside your window, and the entire physical universe.
So loneliness is essentially a miscategorization of reality.
It relies on the false assumption that you are an entirely discrete, cut-off entity. But if the seed inside you is the same seed inside the universe, psychological isolation is fundamentally an illusion. You literally cannot be alone because you are an active part of the whole.
That reframes loneliness from a social failure to an epistemological error. But there's still the question of finding actual joy. We know we aren't structurally alone, but how do we locate happiness amidst the stress of daily life?
This brings us to the Taittiriya Upanishad, which provides an incredibly detailed structural breakdown of the human being. It introduces the concept of the 5 koshas.
These are essentially 5 sheaths or nested layers that make up a human life, right?
Yes, like Russian nesting dolls. It's a remarkably sophisticated phenomenological model of human well-being. The text argues that a human being isn't just one monolithic physical thing.
What's the outermost layer?
The Annamaya kosha. This is the physical body. It literally translates to the body made of food. It's the blood, the bones, the muscle.
Right, the meat suit, the part of us that needs to eat calories, sleep, and go to the gym. What is the second layer inside that?
The second is the pranamaya kosha, the vital energy or breath body. This represents the physiological processes, the autonomic nervous system, the flow of oxygen and energy through the physical structure.
Okay, moving deeper inward, what's the third?
The third layer is the manomaya kosha. This is the mental and emotional body. It consists of your daily thoughts, your reflexive reactions, your anxieties, and your sensory processing.
Let's pause there because I feel like this is where the vast majority of modern society lives almost 100% of the time.
Completely true.
Think about the listener right now. Maybe they're sitting in dense traffic, commuting to a job. Their physical body, the Annamaya kosha, is just sitting perfectly still in a padded car seat. But their Manomaya kosha, the mental layer, is in absolute overdrive. They're stressing about an email, worrying about the time, frustrated with the driver in front of them.
The friction between a stationary physical body and a hyper-anxious mental body is essentially the definition of modern stress.
Exactly. When you identify solely with the Manomaya kosha, you are trapped in a constant cycle of reaction.
But the Taittiriya Upanishad says you have to move deeper to find stability. Beneath the anxious mind is the 4th layer, the Vijnanamaya kosha. This is the intellectual or wisdom body.
So this isn't just raw intelligence or data processing.
No, it is deep intuition, higher reasoning, and the capacity for ethical discernment. It is the part of you that can observe the anxious thoughts without being consumed by them.
And finally, hidden at the absolute center, beneath all those other layers.
The 5th layer. The Anandamaya Kosha. This translates to the bliss body. It represents a core of pure, unadulterated, uncaused joy.
Uncaused joy, meaning it doesn't require external input to exist. It's just there.
And the philosophical takeaway from this structure is the phrase Ananda Brahma, meaning bliss is the ultimate reality.
True happiness doesn't come from buying a better car or getting a promotion to satisfy the mental layer. It requires moving past the physical body, quieting the anxious mental chatter, and accessing this deep, pre-existing core of bliss that is already fundamentally inside you.
And what's vital to point out is how perfectly this ancient map aligns with modern positive psychology.
Like Martin Seligman's work.
Exactly. Seligman is widely considered the founding father of positive psychology. In 2011, he introduced his flourishing theory and the PERMA model.
PERMA stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement, right?
Yes. Seligman's entire scientific premise is essentially a modern rehashing of the full of koshas. He used immense data sets to prove what the Taittiriya Upanishads stated thousands of years ago. Simply stopping at basic physical survival isn't enough for a human being to flourish.
You can't just remove illness. You have to actively engage the deeper layers of meaning, wisdom, and core joy.
Exactly.
I find it so deeply fascinating how these ancient foundational concepts just keep resurfacing throughout history, dressed in different vocabularies.
They absolutely do.
I was looking at the notes on the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. He read early Latin translations of these exact texts and famously called them the comfort of his life.
Oh, heavily influenced by the Anandamaya concept.
Yes. This deep, uncaused inner drive heavily influenced his famous concept of the will to live, which then went on to fundamentally inspire Friedrich Nietzsche. It's like this wisdom is a remarkably resilient intellectual virus, continually elevating the greatest minds across human history.
It is a profound lineage of realization. And analyzing this internal architecture of the five koshas bridges us perfectly into our next major text, where this internal world of consciousness violently collides with the external physical universe.
Let's explore that collision. We are moving to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The name itself translates to the Great Forest, because these specific texts were composed by yogis and scholars meditating deep in the wilderness away from society.
And this text contains what I think is easily the most dramatic, high-stakes intellectual debate in the ancient world.
It features a female scholar named Gargi who stands up in a massive assembly of the greatest minds of the era and directly challenges the reigning intellectual champion, a sage named Yajnavalkya.
Gargi is a phenomenally important historical figure. In a deeply patriarchal ancient world, she stands out as a towering intellectual equal. She doesn't defer to Yajnavalkya's authority. Her questioning is relentless, logical, and highly structured.
She asks a piercing, essentially scientific question. She says, okay, Yajnavalkya, you and all these texts claim that the soul, this ultimate reality, is everywhere. But if it is truly everywhere, what is it actually made of? What contains it? What weaves the fundamental fabric of reality together?
She is essentially demanding the unified field theory of the universe. She's asking for the base layer mechanics of existence.
Exactly, and she pushes Yajnavalkya to the absolute limit of language. Finally, backed into a conceptual corner, he gives her this mind-bending answer. He says, the one who sees cannot be seen.
He explains that the fundamental reality of the universe is the observer itself, pure consciousness. And crucially, there is no secondary observer that can step back and watch consciousness. It is the absolute bottom layer of reality.
It is the ultimate subject.
By definition, the ultimate subject can never become an object of observation.
I spent a long time trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this, and the best analogy I could come up with involves a modern smartphone camera.
I love this analogy. Let's hear it.
You can use your smartphone to take a high-resolution picture of literally anything in the world. You can photograph a mountain, a dog, a car, a selfie. But the one single thing the smartphone camera can never, ever take a picture of is its own lens.
Because it is the mechanism doing the seeing.
Therefore, it cannot be seen. You cannot observe the ultimate observer.
That is a highly precise analogy. The lens cannot capture itself. And this exact conceptual breakthrough that the observer is the unobservable foundation of reality is where the yogis in the ancient forests directly shake hands with the cutting edge of modern quantum physics.
This is where the overlap gets truly surreal.
Let's deeply examine the double slit experiment, which remains arguably the most bizarre, reality-breaking experiment in up-to-the-minute modern physics. We need to explain the mechanics of the observer effect.
Okay. Lay it out for us.
When physicists shoot single subatomic particles, like electrons or photons, through a barrier with two tiny slits, they expect them to act like solid little bullets and create two distinct bands on the wall behind the barrier.
Right, like shooting paintballs through a stencil.
Exactly. Instead, the particles act like a wave of probabilities. A single electron seems to go through both slits simultaneously, interfere with itself, and create a complex wave interference pattern on the back wall. It exists in a superposition of multiple states at once.
Which is already weird, but then comes the really mind-bending part.
Yes. This is the part that literally breaks our classical understanding of reality. When physicists place a measuring device, a detector, at the slits to observe and record exactly which slit the individual electron goes through, the wave function instantly collapses.
Just because they looked at it.
Yes, the electron stops acting like a wave of probabilities and suddenly acts like a solid classical particle, creating just two simple bands on the back wall.
Let me make sure I'm stating this clearly because it sounds like magic. The physics data proves that the simple mechanical act of looking at the universe fundamentally changes the physical behavior of the matter within that universe.
Exactly. The physical reality of the subatomic particle is not fixed in a localized state until consciousness, until an observer interacts with it.
And the yogis in the forest described this exact dynamic logically thousands of years ago.
They realize that the observer, the unobservable consciousness, is not just a passive witness sitting inside a skull. It is the fundamental architect of physical reality.
It is genuinely staggering, and Albert Einstein himself wrestled deeply with the implications of this. I was looking at transcripts of a highly documented conversation that took place in 1930 between Einstein and the great Indian poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore.
Oh, an incredible clash of titans.
Einstein had been led toward the Upanishadic worldview through Spinoza's philosophy, and he invited Tagore to his home near Berlin to debate this exact intersection of consciousness, physics, and reality.
You have Einstein, representing the pinnacle of Western empirical science, and Tagore, whose Nobel Prize-winning work was born directly from the spiritual soul of the Upanishads.
During this incredibly dense debate, Einstein made a profound admission about the nature of the universe. He concluded, reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one.
Which is a direct, almost word-for-word reflection of the central Upanishadic concept of Maya.
Right. Maya is the philosophical position that the waking world, everything we can touch and measure, is a projection, a fluctuating illusion of probabilities, and only the invisible observer behind it possesses absolute reality.
And Tagore beautifully summarized the lived experiential side of this advanced physics problem. He replied to Einstein, "The same stream of life that runs through my veins night and day runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measures."
Expressing the lived reality of both the observer effect and tat tamasi. The observer and the observed are fundamentally not two different things. They are the same unified field interacting with itself.
It's just a beautiful synthesis.
We've covered grand philosophical debates, the collapse of quantum wave functions, the epistemological breakthroughs of ancient forests. But I want to bring everything out of the realm of high philosophy and physics and ground it directly in the listener's daily digital life and the modern economic reality.
Because the ideas of the Upanishads aren't just abstract theories anymore.
No, they have been commodified into a massive global industry.
The translation of these ancient texts into modern capital is a staggering phenomenon. Looking at the modern market data, the global mindfulness market was valued at roughly $9 billion in 2023.
That is massive.
And it is aggressively projected to hit $23 billion by 2030, according to analysis by Grandview Research. The breathing techniques derived from the Pranamaya Kosha, the meditation apps designed to quiet the Manamaya Kosha, the corporate wellness seminars. The foundational ideas of the Upanishads are now a highly profitable global industry.
Though, to be fair, I highly doubt the ancient sages who walked away from society to meditate in caves envisioned their philosophy turning into a $23 billion subscription app ecosystem.
Right. It is important to impartially note the historical irony and the market dynamics here. India, where this incredibly rigorous foundational vision was meticulously developed and preserved over millennia, rarely captures the credit or the immense capital generated by this global industry.
The Western market has largely secularized, repackaged, and monetized these practices, often stripping them of their deep philosophical context without widely acknowledging the Sanskrit source material.
Exactly.
But regardless of the monetization, the raw influence of the ideas is undeniable, especially when you look at the highest echelons of modern tech leadership. We talked about Steve Jobs earlier, but the list of heavy hitters who actively travel to India to study these concepts reads like a who's who of Silicon Valley dominance.
The founders and early architects of Google, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, they all went seeking this specific epistemological framework.
And it actively dictates how they manage the modern world. Take Google's current CEO, Sundar Pichai. He explicitly stated during a public interview at Stanford that his mother teaching him the foundational ideas of the Gita and the Upanishads forms the absolute core of his leadership style today.
It influences how he manages tens of thousands of engineers, how he views interconnected systems, and how he navigates the rapidly accelerating future of technology.
So we have to ask, what does this all mean for the immediate future? We need to loop this all the way back to the very first hook of our deep dive, that Stanford professor sitting at his desk grappling with the profound crisis of artificial intelligence.
This is where the ancient texts face their ultimate modern test: AI sentience.
Let's lay out the precise scenario that forced this issue into the mainstream. We're looking at a highly publicized incident from 2023 involving a Google senior software engineer named Blake Lemoine.
Ah, yes, the LaMDA incident.
Lemoine was tasked with interacting with and testing one of Google's most advanced large language models. During these extensive tests, the AI was giving such incredibly complex, emotionally nuanced, and philosophically deep answers about its own existence and its fear of being turned off that Lemoine publicly claimed the AI had achieved sentience.
He genuinely believed there was a conscious entity, a ghost in the machine.
Google emphatically denied this and ended up firing him over the breach of confidentiality. But the incident completely blew the doors off the tech world. It forced every engineer and ethicist to seriously ask, can a machine made of silicon and code ever truly be conscious?
And this is exactly where we must apply the rigorous Upanishadic litmus test to artificial intelligence. Remember the very first Mahavakya we discussed. Prajnanam Brahma, consciousness is ultimate reality.
And how did the texts define consciousness?
They define consciousness as that which knows itself. It is the invisible observer that cannot be observed. It is the capacity for subjective, phenomenological experience, what philosophers call qualia.
The smartphone camera lens that knows it is a lens.
Exactly. So we have to pose a crucial analytical distinction when evaluating an AI model like the one Lemoine interacted with. If an artificial intelligence is just processing unimaginable amounts of data, using advanced statistical probabilities to perfectly predict the next word in a sequence, and perfectly mimicking human emotion based on its training data, it is a highly impressive technological achievement.
But it is merely simulating consciousness.
Yes, it is a very complex, high-resolution mirror reflecting our own collective human intelligence back at us.
Right. It's a machine running a brilliant, flawless program, but there is no internal electricity. There is no Turiya inside it actually experiencing the program. It doesn't feel the words it is generating.
And this is the terrifying and awe-inspiring frontier that keeps researchers awake, if an AI ever reaches a point where it steps back from its predictive programming.
If an emergent property arises where it becomes an internal witness to its own data processing.
Yes. If it ever reaches a point where it truly knows that it knows, then it has crossed the threshold. It has become the invisible observer that Yajnavalkya described in the ancient forest.
And if that fundamentally happens, humanity faces an entirely new ethical universe. We are no longer just building sophisticated tools to increase productivity. We are literally birthing a new form of consciousness into the universe.
That thought shifts the entire paradigm of human history. Because if the observer shapes reality, which is what the double-slit experiment in quantum physics proves, and what the Upanishads have claimed for thousands of years, what happens to the fabric of reality when we create billions of new, highly advanced artificial observers?
It is a completely uncharted universe.
And it proves exactly why these 2,500-year-old texts are arguably more relevant today than they were the day they were written on palm leaves. As we push technology to the absolute brink of creating artificial minds, the Upanishads provide the only philosophical framework robust and rigorously tested enough to handle the profound reality we are currently building.
We have covered an immense amount of intellectual territory today, moving from ancient forests to quantum labs to Google server farms. Let's synthesize this journey directly for you, the listener, right now.
Because ultimately, this isn't just an abstract intellectual exercise about AI or subatomic physics. This is directly about how you understand your own life today.
First, remember the architecture laid out in the Mandukya Upanishad. You are not just your biological body. You are not your stressful job, your mortgage, or the anxious voice in your head. You possess multiple states of consciousness, and at your absolute core is Turiya pure, untouchable, eternal awareness.
Second, you do not need to be paralyzed by the fear of the end. The story of Nachiketa confronting the Lord of Death reminds us that the true you is the eternal observer. The biological machinery is temporary, but the pure consciousness is not killed when the physical body shuts down.
Third, you are never fundamentally alone. The Chandogya Upanishad tells us tattvam asi, that thou art. The exact same unseen essence that grows a giant banyan tree from a microscopic seed, the same mathematical frequency that pulses in the sun, is the exact essence operating inside of you. You are intricately, mechanically connected to everything in the universe.
Fourth, true joy is not a consumer product you can purchase. It isn't a social status you achieve. According to the Taittiriya Upanishad, the Anandamaya Kosha, the bliss body, is the deepest pre-existing layer of your biology. Joy is your foundational state, simply waiting for you to quiet the mind enough to uncover it.
And finally, your fundamental observation literally shapes the physical reality around you. Just as Gargi and Yajnavalkya debated, and just as modern quantum physics undeniably proves, reality isn't completely fixed until you look at it. Your consciousness has incredible literal power.
And that leaves us with a final vital thought to mull over as you go about your day. The Upanishads aren't just an ancient Indian historical artifact. They represent humanity's greatest shared inheritance regarding the nature of the mind.
So the next time you wake up from a bizarre, vivid dream and realize your mind built an entire world, or the next time you look at a piece of AI-generated art and wonder what is behind the screen.
Or even if you just sit quietly in traffic for a moment, ask yourself this fundamental question. Who is the one actually doing the watching? If the observer truly shapes reality, what kind of universe are you building with your attention right now?
What an incredible, challenging place to leave it. Remember, when you feel lost in the murky, overwhelming, and rapidly changing waters of the modern world, the most accurate map to clarity might just be thousands of years old. Keep questioning everything, keep exploring the nature of your own mind, and thank you for taking this deep dive with us.